Ever wondered how the Vietnam War might have gone differently? Here's one interesting scenario. Suppose the US military of today time travels to 1965 Vietnam, just as the US involvement in that war is ramping up, and replaces the original US military of 1965. How would this alternate history play out? How long would the war last? And could the US win this time? Let's imagine that soon after the US escalates its involvement in late 1964, the entire 1965 US military gets replaced with today's forces: troops, planes, tanks, missile satellites, and everything else. In 1965, the US military had just over 2.6 million personnel, with about 180,000 in the Vietnam area. By 1968, at the height of US involvement, over 500,000 were stationed in Vietnam. The US total military grew to 3.5 million. Back then, the draft was used heavily, sending many conscripts into combat. Today's volunteer military might not rely on draftees. Also in the 1960s, reservists and guardsmen were used sparingly. Only about 15,000 were deployed, since sending draftees was seen as causing less political backlash than mobilizing the better connected, more affluent and vocal reservists. Today's active US Army is less than half the size it was in 1965, though the Marine Corps is nearly as large. This thought experiment can't explore the global effects of a smaller overall US force. Back then, much of the military might have needed to be redeployed from Europe and Asia just to match 1968 frontline numbers in Vietnam. But maybe all the troop levels of the peak of 1968 wouldn't even have to be reached. Let's see. The US military's original goal in Vietnam was to prevent a North Vietnamese takeover of the South. Taking the North wasn't part of the mission, making it a defensive ground war. In the air, though, the US carried out offensive missions over North Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia to disrupt logistics and supplies. Today's Air Force would have similar goals. However, today's Air Force, while far more advanced, is only half the size of its 1965 counterpart. So if some aircraft must remain stationed elsewhere to protect North America from Soviet bombers or maintain presence in Europe, South Korea, and Japan, only a portion would be available for Vietnam. At its 1968 peak, US air power had just under 1,000 combat planes in the region. Given modern numbers, it's likely that no more than 500 would be deployed at peak times. But let's go chronologically. In December 1964, just before the modern US forces' arrival, the Viet Cong won a frontline battle against the South Vietnamese army. Up to then, Viet Cong operations were mostly small-scale guerrilla ops. They moved supplies through neighboring countries' territory and parts of Vietnam not under government control, though most of Viet Cong recruits were from South Vietnam. At the time, the Viet Cong numbered over 100,000 personnel, supported by North Vietnam's army, which didn't begin major direct assaults until 1965. To keep things fair, the modern US forces won't get historical knowledge of the war or their enemy, so Viet Cong tactics in 1965 would still come as a surprise. Still, modern forces would be far better equipped to fight a guerrilla war, thanks to decades of US counterinsurgency experience. Modern signals intelligence would intercept nearly all enemy radio traffic, though in the 1960s, North Vietnam and especially the Viet Cong relied little on radio communications. A more effective way to track Viet Cong and North Vietnamese formations in 1965 would be through reconnaissance assets. This includes not just US satellites, capable of monitoring large troop movements, depots, and facilities, but also today's vast fleet of aerial recon and surveillance platforms. In 1965, recon was limited. Recon planes and satellites used film, and processing to an attack took days, too slow to target mobile enemy units. Today, the military can often respond within minutes, with many other advanced capabilities in play. Though today's recon aircraft fleet is only 40% the size of the 1965 fleet, its capabilities are vastly superior. Back then, aerial recon required direct overflight. Radar surveillance wasn't feasible, and early AWACS could track enemy aircraft out to just 100 miles. Today, fighter-sized planes can be tracked up to 300 miles away. Radar can produce synthetic images of battlefield vehicles, and modern recon planes can use cameras from 150 miles away while achieving sub-meter resolution. Even sensors on Reaper drones could conduct surveillance over the sea, outside the reach of Vietnamese SA-2 SAMs. They would need constant fighter escorts, but this could be useful if it lures North Vietnamese planes into combat. However, the best use of Reapers would likely be defensive recon over South Vietnam, monitoring Viet Cong and border areas where SA-2s weren't deployed. The air war over Vietnam was primarily characterized by US airstrikes and North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile operations. North Vietnam typically operated several dozen fighters at a time that managed to shoot down 67 US planes during the war, losing twice as many in return. Over 300 more US planes were downed by SA-2 and shoulder-launched SAMs, while a staggering 2,100 were lost to ground fire. Unguided bombs required low-altitude release, and flying low was often considered safer than risking SAM fire, despite the danger from anti-aircraft guns. With today's technology, most of those losses wouldn't happen. Modern US planes have superior situational awareness, making surprise air attacks nearly impossible. Long-range missiles, standoff weapons, and high-altitude precision-guided bombs would render Vietnamese air ambushes largely ineffective. While SA-2 batteries were relocatable, they weren't mobile, and modern surveillance would easily detect and destroy them, often as they activated. Anti-radar missile technology has also improved significantly. Unlike in Vietnam, simply shutting off radar wouldn't be enough to avoid being hit. Modern US fighter jets can now use radar to generate synthetic images, identify targets from a distance, and use advanced friend or foe systems. These issues limited US pilots during the Vietnam War, often administratively forcing them into short-range combat. Today, most US combat planes could independently detect SA-2 sites. Even during the 1960s, US electronic jamming improved significantly, but today's jamming and stealth tech would make the SA-2 nearly irrelevant. Essentially, the US would dominate the skies. The only vulnerable aircraft would be low-flying helicopters. However, even those would benefit from better recon, more AA sites being destroyed, and improved onboard warning systems. Still, since about half of Vietnam-era US helicopter losses were from non-combat causes, modern losses would remain notable, due to heavy usage, hard landings, and operational wear. Overall, US forces in Vietnam would benefit from vastly improved intelligence and mobility. They would track the Viet Cong more effectively, especially the larger North Vietnamese army formations later in the war. Ambushes would be less frequent, and helicopters would face less enemy fire, increasing army's mobility. Air support would also be far more effective, with today's sensors and precision bombs keeping Vietnamese forces at bay. Modern Apache and Viper attack helicopters are vastly superior to the early model Cobra attack helicopters rushed into Vietnam, also more numerous until the end of 1960s. Crucially, the entire US force, from aircraft and vehicles to individual soldiers, can now detect targets 24/7. In the Vietnam era, even basic night vision was rarely used. Today, most combat vehicles and infantry squads are equipped with thermal imaging or advanced night vision with infrared illumination, making it normal to spot soldiers through smoke or darkness at 100 to 200 yards. Even jungle foliage would provide a bit less cover. US forces might be the one to go on the offensive at night, conducting search and destroy raids and leveraging their tech advantage. Night movement was key to Viet Cong tactics, scouting, marching, and timing attacks so retreats happened under darkness. All that would be less effective against modern US nighttime sensors. A network of ground sensors near the Laos border could also disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the main supply route for the Viet Cong. Even their extensive tunnel and bunker systems would be harder to construct or conceal under constant modern surveillance. In 1965, guided weapons were rare and unreliable. Today, guided bombs, missiles, and artillery shells are standard. The modern US military is also designed for mobility with lighter vehicles and superior airlift capability, better suited to Vietnam's jungle terrain than the heavy Soviet-focused US Army of the 1960s. Another common Viet Cong tactic was to engage US forces at point-blank range, reducing the effectiveness of US artillery and air support due to the risk of friendly fire. But with better sensors limiting such close encounters and guided weapons increasing strike precision, the Viet Cong would face more overwhelming firepower. South Vietnam's army initially lost a few thousand troops annually to Viet Cong guerrillas, but from 1965 losses reached five-digit figures. US casualties were also rising quickly: 2,065, 6,066, and 11,067, peaking at nearly 17,000 in 1968 before declining. Note that US figures are total for all services, while South Vietnamese numbers refer to the army only. Modern-day US casualties would look very different. The Viet Cong would struggle to organize covert attacks, and supply trails through Laos and Cambodia would be more effectively targeted by air, helicopter, and drone strikes. They would be more weakened. North Vietnam's central logistics, training, and troop concentrations would be under constant precision air attacks. Hundreds of planes might be lost, mostly due to unavoidable accidents. US ground forces would suffer more casualties than air units, but still far fewer than in the original timeline. South Vietnamese troops would benefit from better intel and fire support, reducing their losses as well. Essentially, the original US strategy could have materialized, at least partially. When the real timeline US first came in numbers in Vietnam in 1965, three phases were envisioned. Phase 1 – halt territory losses by the end of 1965. Phase 2 – launch major offensives and destroy organized enemy forces by the end of 1966. And Phase 3 – achieve victory by late 1967 with even remote enemy bases destroyed. In reality, Phase 1 was mostly successful. The trend was reversed, and by mid-1966, most of South Vietnam was cleared of Viet Cong pockets. In this alternate timeline, progress would be faster, and North Vietnam might struggle to equip and amass forces for its major 1968 offensive, the Tet Offensive. Up to then, North Vietnam generally avoided large-scale battles. But with increased casualties and supply losses, it's unclear what offensive capability they could maintain. In the real timeline, the Tet Offensive gained little territory and was a near disaster for North Vietnam. They lost tens of thousands of troops, mostly Viet Cong, who never recovered and couldn't replenish using South Vietnamese countryside recruits. However, the US was shocked by the scale of the offensive. Despite holding the line, it became a turning point. The US realized a far greater military commitment would be required. Troop morale collapsed, desertions quadrupled, and politically the decision was made not to commit further. Even the US generals who supported escalation in 1965 concluded in 1968 that the casualties weren't worth it and advocated withdrawal. The US had already decided not to take the ground war into North Vietnam or Laos. Officially no over-border incursions. For the US, it was a defensive war almost from the start, carefully limiting its own casualties. After 1968, the US grew weary of the war. Peace talks with North Vietnam began in May, even as the Tet Offensive was proving a failure. The US used it as a pretext to start withdrawing. By late 1968, the US agreed to halt bombing North Vietnam. With Nixon taking office in 1969, US forces shifted to a more defensive posture and began gradually pulling out. In this new timeline, even if North Vietnam managed a Tet-sized offensive, they would suffer far heavier casualties, despite modern US forces likely being smaller than the 1968 peak of 500,000. Realistically, the North likely couldn't amass enough forces before 1969, and due to superior modern US recon, those forces would be tracked earlier, achieving less surprise. A quick note: North Vietnam had a larger population than the South, but its manpower still had its limits. A 1968 CIA report estimated 120,000 men per year reached fit-for-service status. In contrast, South Vietnam had fewer people to conscript and far lower morale, with 100,000 desertions annually. However, with more effective US support, heavier northern losses, fewer southern casualties, and an even more disastrous Tet offensive, South Vietnam's morale might improve, allowing time to properly train a large army. South Vietnam was more militarized per capita, so if better results would encourage the US continue its backing, North Vietnam might not have the resources to launch the 1972 Easter Offensive. Even if they did, it would likely be delayed. That 1972 offensive was the first time the North Vietnamese used massed armored vehicles, which had some success despite US air power helping the South. But with today's US military involved, tracking and destroying such vehicles would be simple. The Easter Offensive could fail as badly as Tet. In the real timeline, by 1970, US troops had left the front lines, performing only static defense. By late 1971, troop levels dropped to 150,000, and by 1972, only 24,000 remained. North Vietnam used the years between Tet and Easter offensives to rebuild. When they finally launched a large-scale attack in spring of 1972, South Vietnam began its final decline. Despite the Paris Peace Accords, South Vietnam collapsed in 1975 after another northern offensive. By then, US government and US public support had vanished completely. And that's what really matters. How would the US government and public of the late 1960s and early 1970s react to this alternate Vietnam War? Public unrest would likely be much lower, fewer US casualties, perhaps several times fewer, and likely no need for a draft. Still, every military intervention has a time limit, especially one fought halfway around the world. Just like in the real timeline, peace talks with North Vietnam could again make the US seize the opportunity, declare mission accomplished, and begin withdrawal. The US government was fighting high inflation at the time, and funding the Vietnam War was unpopular. Also, Nixon had aimed to bring China closer to the US. Reapproachment began in 1972, just as South Vietnam was faltering. China had been vital to North Vietnam's war effort, perhaps even more than the Soviet Union, supplying weapons, repair crews, anti-aircraft personnel, and general support. The US was willing to trade in support for South Vietnam for better relations with China to counter the Soviets. That kind of geopolitical calculation would still shape any alternate US military involvement. In reality, the US didn't lose militarily. It never truly went on the offensive. It prioritized limiting casualties and eventually chose to exit. Had it stayed, North Vietnam would not have won. A modern military today would have even less trouble holding back the North. The real question is how long political leaders would finance that protection, and when they would decide to leave. Attacking and defeating North Vietnam outright was never seriously considered. The US feared that an all-out invasion could provoke Soviet or Chinese intervention. Once better relations with China became possible, such an attack was politically off the table. Even entering Laos to cut off Viet Cong supply routes could have helped greatly, and the 1960s US military could have done it as well, though at the costs of tens of thousands of lives and greater instability. But politics wouldn't allow it. It wasn't even attempted. Could the modern military do all that as well? Sure. If the US unleashed its full power and no Soviet and Chinese intervention occurred, the North would eventually fall. In the end, modern US forces might extend their stay a few years longer than in the real timeline, but they would still leave eventually. As in the actual post-1973 scenario, military aid and equipment to South Vietnam would likely be cut off. The South might not fall by 1975, but its long-term survival would still be uncertain. This video may have started as a time-traveled thought experiment, but it shows that wars are ultimately won through determination, political support, and morale. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.